Welcome to Discovery Watch with John Kaiser.
I'm your host, Jim Goddard. Welcome back to the show, John.
Jim, pleasure to be back on the show.
John, where does Novo Resources and its WITS 2.0 story stand today?
Well, Jim, the WITS 2.0 story, about which we got so excited back in 2017, looks permanently stalled. And Novo has branched off into other directions. It has revived the Beaton's Creek project in the eastern part of the Pilbara by acquiring the Golden Eagle mill from Millennium Minerals, and they are now using a very close-spaced drilling of the Beaton's Creek oxide resources to open-pit mine ore, and feed it into the Golden Eagle mill. And in November, it averaged 1.3 grams per ton gold and produced 9,223 ounces. The plan is to eventually transition to higher-grade fresh rock once mining approval is received. Though this is still going to be a long, far cry from the world-class vision that WITS 2.0 offered 4 or 5 years ago. But Backhoe Bob will be pleased that Novo will produce 50,000 to 100,000 ounces annually, though it remains to be seen what the profitability for this mining operation will be. Novo is also looking for new discoveries in places like the Malmsbury project in the Fosterville region of Victoria. This Fosterville is famous for making Eric Sprott very rich through Kirkland Lake's Fosterville mine that produced very high-grade gold. They've auctioned 60% of a property from an ASX company called GBM Resources, and they are going to drill there to see if they can find something similar. And they also own 15 million shares of Newfound Gold, which they got through a swap a year and a half ago, and that's worth about $100 million today. And they decided to market and collect an $85 million paper profit that they recorded in their third quarter financials. And Newfound Gold, that position's worth about $105 million right now at the $7 range. That's half of where the stock was earlier this year, where it had a valuation of a couple $2 billion, based on the dream that the northern part of Newfoundland is another Fosterville scale district of very high grade gold. And Newfound Gold has the Queensway project, where there was an old high grade quartz vein hosted resource found decades ago by another company. Got a major drill program going there to delineate it. They did have to put out a press release about a month ago explaining that there seems to be some sort of systematic bias in the way the holes are being assayed, so they're now looking at some new technology that scans the entire core without destroying it to get a more consistent assay for what's in the core. But that play has resulted in all of Newfoundland being staked by juniors of all kinds, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens there. Newfoundland's famous for its VMS systems, of which Buckens was the big one. Everything else is relatively small. But otherwise, Newfoundland has been plagued by the perception that there's lots of flashy little high-grade zones here and there, but there's nothing really world-class in Newfoundland worth developing. I think this effort by Newfound Gold to show that there is something very substantial going on with its Queensway project, and all the juniors, many of them backed by Eric Sprott, all the work that they're going to do looking at everything could end up resulting in the discovery of new types of deposits, or at least bigger scale for existing types of deposits that have been dismissed as small, and maybe turn Newfoundland into a big regional play once we have something there that people can point to and say, wow, we didn't think something this big and good is present, but maybe now there is. But as far as the WITS 2.0 story, which captured our imagination in 2017, it's stalled because the Australian regulators will not allow Novo to solve his measurement problem by doing a 100,000 ton bulk sample on the Comets Well or Purdy's Reward project, which they now own. And the story, for those who may not remember, is that the WITS 2.0 is a play on WITS 1.0, which is the South African Witwatersrand story, where over 150 million ounces have been mined fairly high grade, 10 grams per ton, typically from reefs 1 to 2 meters thick, but laterally very extensive, dipping into the onto the craton there, and hosted by a conglomerate unit. And the reigning theory is that this gold formed through a precipitation event about 2.8 billion years ago, when the blue algae started changing the atmosphere of the world, living in these shallow lagoons, shallow seas, creating oxygen, which changed the chemistry of the seawater, which at the time there was a lot more gold dissolved in it than it was today. This precipitated out into these algae mats and then somehow settled into these fairly thin horizons. The key thing about these South African Wits deposits is that the gold grains, when you look at them under a microscope, they are rounded, meaning detrital. That means that they've been rolled in some sort of abrasive environment, like placer gold, except these individual grains are the width of a human hair. What is different about the Pilbara, which has the same age as the Witwatersrand and Craton, its nuggets are, half inch, sometimes an inch big. They are very large watermelon or cornflake type shaped gold nuggets, and they've been known to exist in the northern Pilbara for a long time. In fact, it's a playground for fossickers, prospectors with metal detectors who walk along this conglomerate unit where it peeks out from underneath the Mount Rowe basalt, and when it beeps, they get their pick and shovel out and they excavate until they find one of these nuggets. And this has been going on for a long time, but what everybody assumed, especially Quentin Henney of Novo, was that they were just finding it in unconsolidated alluvials. And he has been looking in the eastern part of the Pilbara with the Beaton's Creek project, where there is bedrock-hosted nuggety gold mineralization. It's not in any large nugget form, but it is in a sort of patchy form. So it's takes a lot of effort to measure it properly. And he was focused on that, starting to give up when in 2017 he heard about these nuggets being found embedded in actual consolidated conglomerate. And so he rushed over there and realized that possibly ground zero for the WITS 2.0 event in the Pilbara back 2.8 to 2.9 billion years ago was actually in the northern Pilbara, not in the eastern Pilbara where he was operating. So he staked a very large land position, developed the story that where this conglomerate unit sits unconformably on a sort of 3.2 billion year old basement rock. There are numerous of these fairly large nuggets embedded in it. And I picked up the story for Discovery Watch in July of 2017. In August, I visited the project. I saw the scale of it, over 150 to 200 kilometers, wherever the conglomerate peaks out from the younger Mount Rowe basalt. Fossickers had been finding these gold nuggets scattered here and there. And so the WITS 2.0 dream was that these nuggets were directly derived from some sort of wide-scale precipitation event, but rather than showing up as sort of very, very fine grains as in WITS 1.0, for some reason they ended up as these larger nuggets. And this became the problem of how do you measure this? And originally, Quentin saw that there was some fine gold also in these surrounding these nuggets, and the problem with a drill bit is these nuggets are not like side by side as they are in the mineralization in the WITS 1.0. They're scattered here and there, so very easy for a drill bit to measure. But he hoped that perhaps this fine gold that was also present could be diagnostic as to which horizon within the conglomerate that was hosted this nuggety gold. But it turned out that the fine gold was just a tiny halo around the nuggets themselves, and so drilling by sort of September, October of 2017, it was clearly not going to be helpful to delineate anything, and so They started doing bulk samples, but small-scale bulk samples. They also delivered erratic results. And the problem, they decided that we need a 100,000-ton bulk sample to properly measure this, to see what the distribution of the gold is within this conglomerate. But that ended up creating a catch-22 problem for them, because the Australian regulators require, for approving such a large-scale mining operation, 100,000 tons, that's a pretty big trench that you're going to dig. You need to have a JORC resource estimate supporting it. And of course, the whole point of doing the bulk sample was to eventually develop a way to create a JORC resource estimate. So this became the catch-22 that remains unresolved today. They did move over into the Egina area to the east, where the conglomerate is unconsolidated. It sits in marine terraces. It's loose. It has gold in it. They attempted to see if they could develop the gold there, but that seems to have fizzled out. So really, they were still waiting for this approval to tackle the WITS 2.0 hypothesis with a large bulk sample, but it doesn't really seem to be happening. And the Novo, with its vast land position in that northwestern part of Pilbara, it's now starting to think about basement-hosted gold potential, such as De Grey discovered at its Malima project, which also sits in the northern part of the Pilbara. So for people like Backhoe Bob, who thought, oh, you just need to go and mine it, well, the message the Australians are telling him is that no mechanical excavators, nothing allowed. You can go there with a mechanical modern mule called an all-terrain vehicle, but you still have to use pick and shovel to do it. This is a place not for Backhoe Bobs, it's for Donkey Bobs.
We'll have more with John Kaiser right after this.
Media recognition from Bloomberg, Reuters, recycling trade publications. Patented process for 100% recovery of critical metals, including cobalt, lithium, nickel, manganese, aluminum. American Manganese is focused on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. American Manganese trades on the TSX Venture, AMY, the US, AMYZF, and Frankfurt 2AM. For more information, visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Welcome back. We're speaking with John Kaiser. How has the Malima discovery worked out for De Grey Mining?
Jim, I introduced De Grey Mining, which is an Australian stock exchange-listed company, to Discovery Watch on September 30th, 2017, in the midst of the WITS 2.0 boom, based on its substantial land holdings in the Pilbara. Their land holdings, however, generally covered exposed basement rock. What made WITS 2.0 work was this conglomerate unit, which in the northern part had been shaved off by erosion, but it had been protected by a basalt flow called the Mount Roll, which was slightly younger than when these conglomerates were laid down. And the distance between the surface of the Mount Roll and the basement, it deepens as you move inland, eventually getting 1,000 meters deep before the basement is present. When you go much farther inland, that's where all those big iron ore operations are that feed China's steel mills. But what De Grey was focused on, the reason it was just covering, property generally owned basement rocks, it was after these shear zone, a set of regional shear zones that traversed, about 150 kilometers. And they had two properties. One was called Indy, and the other was called Turner River. And they straddled these shear zones, and they had been looking for gold mineralization. They'd found about 5 zones, but these tended to be low grade, and they ranged from about 161,000 ounces to 624,000 ounces. The size wasn't large enough, or the grade wasn't large enough to develop them as standalone mines. And so the perception was that the Pilbara really didn't have what it took to host significant gold deposits. But it turned out that the western part of their property, there was an island of Mount Roll that overlapped with it. They weren't perfect in avoiding the Mount Roll, and spilling out from beneath it was the conglomerate, and that's where the Fossickers had been finding gold nuggets. And so for a brief period, the gray mining was suddenly part of the WITS 2.0 boom. But as we discussed in the Novo segment earlier today, the measurement problem eventually killed the WITS 2.0 story. And the gray management, headed by Sam and Lil and Andy Beckwith, they went back to trying to prove that the Pilbara basement, has significant gold potential. And over the next few years, that helped their stock, which had peaked at 35 cents during the height of the WITS 2.0 boom in 2017. It managed to sag back below 5 cents until early 2020, when they announced a new discovery called the Hemi. And about a week and a half after the stock had risen from 5 cents to 20 cents, I introduced it to Discovery Watch on February 20th, 2020, and explained that this appears to be a game changer for the perception of the Pilbara as a source for serious basement-hosted gold deposits. And, a year earlier at the March 2019 Metals Investor Forum conference, I had talked to Quentin and asked him for an update on, what's his thinking on the whole WITS 2.0 precipitation event, especially given that his presentations were now showing diagrams of traditional rivers feeding nuggets into a sort of a onshore, nearshore environment such as exists in Alaska. And such nuggets would have been derived from hydrothermally in place deposits up in the mountains, got eroded and dumped out into this marine setting where they got rolled around and eventually cemented into the consolidated conglomerate such as exists in the Pilbara. And he says, I'm beginning to think that yes, there was a WITS 1.0 style precipitation event, but it was earlier than these nuggets were formed and probably fed these hydrothermal systems in the Pilbara basement rocks, and then these got in the traditional way eroded, because there's really no good explanation as to how gold precipitating out of solution in a lagoon is going to end up gluing together to form these nuggets half-inch up to an inch in size, whereas in the WITS 1.0 setting, the individual grains are all the width of a human hair, so very tiny, the kind of thing you might expect to precipitate out and end up stuck on some algae mat and eventually settle into a horizon where it gets cemented over and forms a deposit. So he was thinking, yes, there must be significant basement-hosted gold potential, but it's all inland. It's probably just the roots left. Much of it got eroded away, and it's difficult to access because if you're just dealing with the roots, then you are going to have a hard time drilling through the Mount Road to find them. And the conglomerate, well, we still think there's a lot of gold ending up in it, but we need to get this bulk sample permit to really start to assess how is it distributed. And I didn't really like this explanation because this idea of a widespread event that systematically created these nuggets over a vast region within this conglomerate unit. Now we were back to the old placer model of where gold gets eroded from a pinpoint source, distributed through various tributaries into a river system and then dumped into some localized area. So if you took all this 150 kilometers of land that Novo had assembled, which they call the Karatha Project, which covers the edge of the wedge where the Mount Roe ends and the conglomerate peaks out, and the exposed basement of the Pilbara extends until the sea. You weren't going to find this systematically along this strike. You're going to find it in patches. So even if they got a bulk sample, it would just tell you what was in that bulk sample. It wouldn't really tell you what would be in the rock and the conglomerate, 1,000 meters along strike. So to me, this was kind of a depressing outcome, and I lost interest in the whole WITS 2.0 story because there wasn't this grand precipitation event that was the direct source of the nuggets. The nuggets were an indirect source of an older precipitation event that got digested and remobilized and deposited through traditional hydrothermal activity. So when I saw this Hemi discovery of de Grey, I jumped onto it and said, this is a big game changer. And it turns out that this really is the case. In the 2 years since then, almost 2 years, they have now delineated a resource of 192.4 million tons, grading 1.1 gram per ton gold for 6.8 million ounces within that Hemi zone. And most of it is within open pitable range. They've completed the Australian equivalent of a PEA for about a 27,000 ton per day open pit mine that would produce an average of over 400,000 ounces annually for a 10-year mine life, and at a 5% discount rate, that generated an after-tax net present value of almost $2 billion Australian and an IRR, internal rate of return, of 49.4%, and CapEx came in at 836 million. These are Australian dollar figures. 60% of the gold is free milling, but the rest is refractory. So to get it all out, they will have to do a pressure oxidation circuit, something similar to what Perpetua Gold Corp is planning for the Stibnite project. But still, it is an extraordinary improvement from what we had before. They are now working on a pre-feasibility study, and for me, the big story is the conceptual breakthrough, the combined Indy-Turner River project, which they now call the Malima. That covers over 150 kilometers of exposed Pilbara basement where there are a number of regional shear zones. This one is one they hadn't really explored before the Antwerp trend, but they now have a reason to look a lot harder at this. And while they're doing all the feasibility demonstration work with this particular, the Hemi cluster of deposits, eventually what they learn, they'll be able to apply to this whole thing. So de Grey will eventually, if not swallowed by one of the bigger companies, eventually become a major gold company. And earlier this year, they hit $1.67, and they have 1.3 billion shares out. So that was a market value of 2.2 billion Australian. It's settled back to $1.15 right now, in line with the general misery afflicting resource stocks since April, where it has a value of about 1.5 billion. And in contrast, Novo, which has 246 million shares issued, it has a value of about 300 million Canadian at its current $1.30 stock price, and that's largely based on a 50,000 plus ounce per year mine in the Beatons Creek area, whose profitability remains to be determined. And so it's a complete reversal of what we were thinking back in 2017 when Nova was the WITS 2.0 star. de Grey was this WITS 2.0 tag-along. Now de Grey is a substantial company, a future gold producer with extraordinary land position to find more of this basement-hosted Pilbara gold, and Novo scrambling to reinvent itself by chasing off into all these other directions. Maybe they'll eventually get WITS 2.0 story back on track, but for now, that looks pretty much dead. And it's an irony that one of my perennial bottom fish, Yale Simpson's Rugby Mining, they owned the Turner, or had under option, the Turner River project until 2016, the same project where the Hemi deposit was discovered in early 2020 after years of effort by the de Grey team. So I'm optimistic heading into 2022. I've just finished my bottom fish research of Canadian companies. I published a list of 175 companies that are all developing some sort of bottom after a miserable period since April. And Rugby, of course, is one of those companies. They've picked up a new Chilean project, and are going to be trying to repeat their success with Exeter. And I'm quite looking forward to tackling the Australian bottom fishing season next year when I start tackling all the Australian companies and grinding through their projects to see what they've done and what they've acquired in the past year.
John, thank you so much for the update.
You're welcome, Jim.
I've been speaking with John Kaiser, his website, kaiserresearch.com. I'm Jim Goddard.
Comments made on Discovery Watch are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any manner whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Archived online at HowStreet.com. Discovery Watch is a production of How Street Media Incorporated.